Alon Burstein is here to discuss not only that, but also the wider Middle East. Alon, as always, it's good to see you. So I'll read a little bit more from what we've been hearing out of the Middle East as of late, and I'll specifically ask you first about the nuclear talks. We heard from the BBC, and I was reading reporting from the BBC that says that both parties, Iran and the U.S., as well as the facilitator, Oman, had jointly decided to postpone Saturday's meeting for logistical and technical reasons. That's what they say, logistical, technical. The U.S. said the timing of the talks had not even been confirmed in the first place. No one is outwardly going to say what I'm about to say, Alon, but is this a sign that the talks aren't going as smoothly as they began? President Trump did threaten sanctions against buyers of Iranian oil today. What do you make of this all?
It's good to see you, Austin. At this point, we don't really know. The initial reports were simply that the talks were postponed, and that was it. Everything that came after that you now mentioned, the reports coming out of the United States saying, actually, the talks were never scheduled. So it's not that they were postponed, we just haven't scheduled them yet. The Foreign Secretary of Oman saying that no, the reason they were postponed, he did use the word postponed, was logistical reasons, and that is the reason why they were postponed. Iran then reported and said that the reason is internal disagreements within the United States. We don't know what they're referring to, if they're referring to anything, or if that is just a cover-up. What is for sure is that there isn't not actually a unified message with regards to if this meeting was originally scheduled and what is the reason why it is being postponed. Another important factor, in addition to Trump's threat that then was issued several hours later, there were also supposed to be talks at a separate channel between Iran and Germany, France, and the United Kingdom on the Friday with regards to their own nuclear deal. It's important to remember, with the nuclear deal that was originally signed between the sides in 2015, the United States pulled out, but the European powers and Iran are still committed to that deal. So there's two different channels going on. Those talks were also postponed quite suddenly. So at this point, we don't actually know. It seems more likely that there's internal disagreements going on within Iran with regards to how the talks are going to develop, and no one really wants to say that, because at this point, it would be kind of detrimental if the United States were to say that possibly the supreme leader doesn't want a deal, and so there's disagreements. That would be damning to Trump's attempts to get a deal. Iran obviously doesn't have an interest in saying that, so everyone seems to be covering up for something. Is it a crisis in the talks? No, I don't think that at this point we're looking at a complete collapse of the talks. However, does it mean that maybe the talks are even getting more serious, and that's why all of a sudden people are saying, whoa, 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 we need to see, what are we talking about? Are we willing to agree to this or that? Possibly that. We'll learn more in the coming days, and I really would look to that channel between Iran and the European powers, because that is something that would be easier for Iran to maybe get back on track with, as opposed to the United States. So I'm going to look to that in the next coming days to see if that is restored, those talks. Maybe that'll be a sign where the winds are blowing with the entire negotiation rounds.
Let's talk about the White House. This is the first time I've talked to you since the Trump presidency hit the 100-day mark. Take this question in any direction you want, Alon. What comes to mind when I ask for the most consequential facets of the current White House's influence on the Middle East? What has Trump meant for the region?
So it's a big question, obviously. The biggest thing going on in the Middle East is probably the Israel-Hamas War, but then there's also the talks with Iran, and there's a broader sort of map of alliances in the Middle East. So I'll say something about all three. With regards to the Israel-Hamas War, when Trump came into the White House, he really sort of shot in all directions. Before he was even inaugurated, he personally called Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and said, you have to come to a deal. I want to see a truce when I am being inaugurated. I want to see hostages released. And Netanyahu agreed to the deal on terms that were worse than were originally proposed by Biden. Netanyahu agreed because Trump said so. And all of a sudden, there was this view within Israel and possibly the Middle East. Okay, Trump is sort of automatically on Israel's side, but hey, he got actually a truce. Then, a month later, we have Netanyahu standing in the White House with Trump, and Trump announces that the United States is going to take Gaza. The Palestinians are going to be, he changed his rhetoric here and there, but the bulk of the time was saying they're going to be evacuated. Some said ethnic cleansing, some said that they would willfully leave, but they wouldn't have a choice, and they would not be able to return. That took the Middle East in an entire different direction. Then he threatened all hell breaking loose in Gaza if all the hostages don't come back by the beginning of February. That didn't happen. Then, since then, he's changed his tone a little bit. There's all kinds of rumors that he's not happy with the way the IDF is operating in the Gaza Strip. He doesn't see a point to what Israel's doing at this moment, and that Israel's starting to feel the heat with regards to that. So he's had a lot of impact on the trajectory of the war between Israel and Hamas, but that impact has been every which way, towards truces as well as towards fanning the flames. With regards to the deal with Iran, we talked about that already. Everyone expected Trump to also come in with a very hardline approach towards Iran. But one of the hallmarks of Trump's presidency and his personality in general when it comes to the administration, unpredictability. And one of the key facets that he always comes into the White House with, we saw this in 2016, 2017, we saw this now, whatever the previous administration did, I need to do the opposite and need to do it in full force. So if in 2016-17, the previous administration signed a deal with Iran, I'm going to pull out of the deal and impose sanctions. Now there is no deal with Iran, and Iran was enriching the uranium, and we didn't know where things were going to go. Okay, I'll go to a deal. Biden was threatening war. I'll go to a deal. So that also somewhat took the region by surprise. But like we said, at this point, we don't know which direction it's going. One last thing I'll say with regards to the broader sort of network of alliances. One of the things that you have to remember about the Middle East is the Middle East is a very unstable place. And very often, one of the sort of ironies of it is that a lot of things aren't done in formalized agreements. A lot of things are done sort of these tacit agreements, almost trust between countries, even when they're enemies. Syria and Israel didn't have a peace treaty, but for 50 years, they never attacked each other. And there was no questions about that. Same goes between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For the bulk of their history since the Iranian Revolution have been enemies. They don't attack each other. This is done without a lot of treaties. This is done based on everyone agreeing to sort of the rules of the game. All of a sudden, in comes Trump. He is changing the rules of the game all the time. He all of a sudden is going to talk to Iran after he said that Iran should be bombed. In October, he was advocating that Israel should bomb Iran. At the same time, like I said, changes his mind about Gaza. And this is causing different leaders in the Middle East to do two things. On the one hand, they get scared. And we're seeing leaders of countries that rely on the United States, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, to be often thinking, wait a minute, do I need to turn elsewhere? And the biggest example of this is Syria. The new regime wants to appeal to the United States, but is also looking to China and Russia and what's going to happen on the one hand. On the other hand, we also see all those leaders know that forming a good personal relationship with Trump is what's important. Everything with Trump works on personal relationships. That's why Netanyahu is constantly heaping praises on Trump. We saw the disastrous meeting between Trump and Zelensky. That's what we can expect to see when Trump is going to arrive for his Middle East tour in a few weeks. Everyone wants to make nice and be friends. That has been his influence on the Middle East. Everyone's scared. They're looking to possibly realign themselves, but mostly they want to be friends with Trump. That is what the leaders are thinking.
So what's been going on in Gaza as of late? You and I have had a lot of conversations lately about Iranian nuclear programs, about the wider Middle East. It's been a while since you and I have really gotten into the nitty-gritty of what's been happening on the battlefield and what's been happening with the Palestinian residents within the Strip. Let's start with some of the military activity that we've been seeing in Gaza. What has the IDF been doing as of late?
So ever since the ceasefire collapsed on March 18th, the IDF started with an airstrike campaign and then started moving its forces on the ground. If you want to increase the camera that's on me, I'll show that it's really moved in two places. It's looked both at the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, specifically at Sajaiya over here, Beit Hanun and Zaytun. And we've seen the IDF more and more encroaching on this area and mostly expanding its buffer zone with the border over here. Then the major operation that the IDF has been doing has been excavating a corridor going from here to here called the Murad corridor that really severs two of the largest cities in Gaza, Khan Yunis and Rafah. What is important about that is that the IDF called upon all Palestinian civilians in Rafah. So everything from this southern area, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, to evacuate to the northern parts or central parts of the Gaza Strip, to the Al-Mawasi refugee zone over here. And they have said, and there's rumors at least, that everything south of this line is going to become a new buffer zone, a new no man's land that the IDF is going to take over. There's even rumors that the IDF may be setting up a humanitarian zone there to distribute aid. We can talk about that maybe later. But really, if that were to be the case, this is a fifth of the Gaza Strip. The Washington Post reported yesterday that, or I think even today, that the IDF thus far has been gradually encroaching on the Gaza Strip, and close to 70% of the territory in Gaza is gradually being declared no man's land. And meanwhile, Palestinian civilians are being moved into these 30%. But in terms of the fighting, what's been happening? We've seen a lot of airstrikes. The big thing that developed over the last week is contrary to what we've been talking about in the past, where I kept on telling you Hamas is not engaging the IDF on the ground. That changed. That changed starting April 24th. We've seen the Al-Qassam brigades engaging the IDF forces in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in Beit Hanun, Sajaiya. We also had reports of IDF forces being ambushed in Tel Sultan and Rafah. We've had over the last week 3 IDF soldiers killed, many more injured. And this is really the first time since the collapse of the ceasefire that Hamas seems to have decided to not have a full-on war and engagement, not sending all of its troops, but they have started to slow the IDF down. That is where we are in the current stage of the fighting. One last thing I'll say about that, it was reported today that in Israel, the cabinet is due to meet in the coming days and is going to vote on a substantial expansion of the operation in Gaza. Formally, the operation in Gaza is supposed to pressure Hamas into a hostage deal. That is yet to happen. So in Israel, they're being very public about it as another attempt to pressure Hamas. But they are still saying that the cabinet is going to vote on a substantial expansion of the operation in the coming days.
If you can, expand on the 70% versus 30%. So if the civilians, Palestinians, are in 30%, the IDF is in 70%, is there any clarity on what the long term looks like for that 70%?
So let me say this. First of all, I looked at what was reported in the Washington Post. It's not entirely clear if what they're talking about is what's being done or what is being planned. And that is very different because right now the facts on the ground are that all Palestinians have been called to evacuate from that southern part of the Gaza Strip that I showed you, from the areas of Rafah, and the buffer zone that is between Gaza and Israel has been declared a no man's land, and the IDF is gradually expanding it. And in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, the IDF is also expanding a buffer zone, sort of moving further towards south, towards Gaza City. So gradually we're having an expansion of the no man's land and an expansion of the areas that the IDF is trying to take control of. At the same time, we have not seen Palestinians called to evacuate all of Gaza City. So that would be anywhere south of this line here that the IDF previously in the war a year ago had called on Palestinians to evacuate since they were allowed to return. We haven't seen a call to do that, nor have we seen that this is becoming a permanent buffer zone over here. So seemingly to me, those are more plans that the IDF may be initiating. How does the long term fit into that? There's all kinds of rumors. There were rumors in Israel, something called the General's Plan that we talked about, I think, by now 6 months ago, that maybe the IDF would take over the northern parts of the Gaza Strip and hold it as a negotiation bargaining with Hamas, possibly towards disarming and Hamas leaving, and the IDF would gradually take over territory and say Palestinians will lose territory until Hamas gives up its governing powers and disarms in the Gaza Strip. That's one rumor that possibly the IDF is intending. Another rumor is that the plan is to set up a humanitarian zone in this area. You know, we've had a substantial collapse of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The World Food Program has announced it's out of food in Gaza, and possibly the IDF is planning an entire humanitarian zone in that area. And maybe that's also a way to try to move Palestinians down south. We don't have any information on what are the long-term plans for this. I will say that what we haven't heard from is the United States with regards to the future plans for the Gaza Strip. Under the Biden administration, the United States was adamant that as far as it's concerned, in the quote-unquote day after in the Gaza Strip, there can be no changing of borders. The area is Palestinian. It will not accept Israel redrafting the borders and saying that it's holding buffer zones permanently. We haven't heard that from the Trump administration. So, of course, it's also being rumored that maybe the IDF is planning a more long-term readjusting the borders in Gaza and holding them permanently. We don't know. It's all rumored. Right now, what can be said is that the majority of Palestinians are again being called into the El Mawasi refugee zone over here. That is currently the humanitarian zone. This area in the central parts of the Gaza Strip is also largely defined as a humanitarian zone. The fighting right now is in the north, in Han Yunis, and Palestinians have been evacuated from Rafah. But if the IDF does launch that substantial expansion of the operation next week, we will likely see more and more Palestinians condensing back again into the El Mawasi humanitarian zone, much like we saw in the bulk of last year in 2024 during the fighting.
So you mentioned the humanitarian conditions. You mentioned the World Food Program. This is something we got to talk about before we go. Humanitarian conditions in Gaza alone. The AP is reporting that for nearly 60 days, No food, fuel, or medicine has entered the Gaza Strip. Why is this happening? And what's the current state of humanitarian conditions in the Strip? Which direction is it heading?
So this is really has been the first time since the launching of the war, since the first 2 weeks of the war, this is the first time that no humanitarian aid has entered into the Gaza Strip. In the first 2 weeks of the war, between October 7th and October 20th of 2023, Israel did not allow any humanitarian aid in, and starting then, there was always some trickle of humanitarian aid. And with every truce and hostage agreement, that increased from 20 trucks a day to 200 trucks a day to at times 600 trucks a day. Then, when the truce ended in this last round, on March 2nd, the first phase of the truce ended and it was not extended. On that moment, Israel announced no more humanitarian aid will enter into the Gaza Strip unless there are advances in the talks in the hostage deal. That has been the situation since then. So this is the longest period since the war began. There's been no entrance of food, no entrance of water, no entrance of fuel, and fuel from the humanitarian perspective is critical because all the electrical lines into the Gaza Strip are also cut off. They have been cut off by Israel since October 11th of 2023. All the electricity in Gaza relies on generators, relies on fuel. Israel says Hamas takes over the fuel, uses it for military purposes, so it's not allowing it in. But at the present time, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very, very close to the most dire it has been since the war began. There are reports of food shortages throughout the Gaza Strip, primarily in northern Gaza, but also in southern Gaza in Khan Yunis. The World Food Program announced on April 24th, I believe, or 25th, that it has run out of food and that it was supplying hot meals every day to 900,000 Palestinians. That is about half the population. The fact that they have run out of food and all of a sudden that population doesn't have that hot meal a day is going to be detrimental, and very, very likely we are going to start seeing massive world pressure coming down upon Israel to try to alleviate the situation. In Israel, it's a political conundrum for the prime minister. On the one hand, he will probably want to and need to succumb to that international pressure, but his coalition partners, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, have threatened if humanitarian aid comes into the Gaza Strip, they will leave the government and tear the government down. Right now, what we are seeing is that the IDF has announced that it is planning a big humanitarian zone in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. That is supposed to be an area that the IDF will control and that Palestinians will arrive there to distribute food as opposed to trucks just coming into the Gaza Strip and then possibly being taken over by Hamas. Remains to be seen what will actually happen in that sense. One last thing I'll say about that. U.S. President Trump, once again, after threatening all hell breaking loose on Gaza if the hostages are not returned, saying that as far as he's concerned, Israel can do whatever it wants. Once the World Food Program announced that it was out of food, all of a sudden, he started taking a different tone. There were reports, well, not reports, he said so in Air Force One that he spoke to Netanyahu and told him to, quote, be good to Gaza. Seemingly, even from the White House, there are starting to be calls saying, okay, what is the long-term plan for the humanitarian situation? You can't just starve the people out. What is going to be your plan? Likely we'll see, especially if the IDF expands its military operations, Israel also relating to how is it going to address the humanitarian situation.
Alon, we've been going long tonight, but there's one more thing. You mentioned the hostages, and that's something, and again, I'll bring it back to this 30% piece of land that we're still talking about, the Palestinians encompassing. I've asked you several times over the course of this war, how is it that they are able to keep living hostages away from the IDF, away from anybody that can do anything to save them? We're talking about already a pretty small area, Gaza itself, but now we're talking about 30% of that small area is now where Palestinians are. How is it that they're still able to hide, and you would know the numbers better than me off the top of your head, over 60, I believe, living and dead hostages. How is it that they're able to still conceal those people while maintaining this fight with the IDF?
I'll say two things about that. One, about how they're possibly doing that, and second, about the numbers. So how they're possibly doing that, the IDF has never invaded the central parts of the Gaza Strip in this war. It has invaded the entire north and the entire south, but the central parts of the Gaza Strip, Deir el-Balah is the biggest city here, and Nusrat refugee camp and El Bureij refugee camp. The IDF has never invaded. Seemingly, I mean, rumors have it, but also facts on the ground, it would appear that most of the hostages are held there. The hostages that have been released reported that they were moved from place to place. Most of them were held in tunnels this entire time. It is important to note a lot of them were actually held in tunnels in the areas that the IDF was operating. It's important to understand that the Gaza Strip is an insanely dense area. And the IDF, as it moves into a region, it often detonates a lot of buildings, but a lot of buildings are still standing. And we've seen the extent of Hamas tunnels in the Gaza Strip. The different hostages that were released reported that they were moved sometimes from apartment to apartment, sometimes above ground, sometimes below ground, within tunnels. But one of the things that October 7th has proven is that Hamas is very smart in how it planned this attack and how it has kept the hostages. More hostages have been killed by IDF activity, according to the IDF, rather than hostages that have been rescued, because Hamas manages to actually keep the hostages in its protected zones and move them around from place to place, according to some reports, within tunnels that are interconnected underground. So that's in terms of how Hamas is managing to do that. In terms of the numbers of hostages, there has been a development in the last couple of days. The current number of hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip are 59, and the official number that has been declared dead by the IDF is 35. However, on April 19th, Hamas announced that the area that Idan Alexander, the last hostage in the Gaza Strip that has U.S. citizenship, was bombed by the IDF. And it said that it doesn't know the fate of Idan Alexander, that it managed to recover the body of his guard, and doesn't know the fate of Idan Alexander. It's the last thing Hamas said about him. Then, on April 28th, speaking to different events that happened in Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was sitting next to his wife, and he said there are currently 24 live hostages in the Gaza Strip, and the camera caught that his wife whispered to him, "No, there's less." And he corrected and said, "Well, I said up to 24 hostages that are alive." Seemingly within Israel, there's starting to be intelligence that more hostages are no longer alive. I'm not going to say killed by the IDF or not. We don't know. That was Hamas's announcement when it came to Idan Alexander, possibly. We don't know. Today, on May 1st, U.S. President Trump also said that there were 24 hostages that were alive, but possibly less now. So it seems that there is some intelligence that is brewing within Israel that may have been shared with the United States about the fate of the hostages right now. We don't know. The official numbers are 24 are alive out of the 59 that remain. But seemingly, I would very, very cautiously say that we've received life signs from the hostages that returned from 21 of the hostages that remain there. So unless they were killed since the fighting resumed in Gaza, we know for a fact that 21 are alive, and they're saying maybe less than 24. So I'm not going to say how many I think are alive, but that is my understanding of the numbers.
All right, we covered a lot today. Alon posts his own Middle East updates on his personal YouTube channel. You can go give him a subscribe there. He's also got 2 little ones that he's taking care of, so he's not working off of 8 hours of sleep, and somehow he still has the same encyclopedic mind as always. Alon, great to see you. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Austin. Have a good night.